I am the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, the program that we've set up 8 years ago, actually to support Ukrainian transition after the first Russian-Ukrainian war, after the annexation of Crimea. And I think what we have seen throughout all those times is that Ukrainian non-state actors, civil society, business, is really the engine behind many changes, designing reforms, helping government and local communities to change their life for better. And it's really tragic to see today such a horrific destruction taking place literally 1,000 kilometers from the center of Berlin, in the center of Europe, where Ukrainians are really defending their way of life. And their way of life is very much similar to the German way of life, where freedom, dignity matters, where Ukrainians want to have institutions that are accountable and transparent. So I'm really pleased that we are convening today a discussion on the back end of what has been a two busy days here in Berlin, starting with the Ukrainian-German Business Forum, following up by the high-level expert conference organized by the G7, German Presidency, Chancellery, and the European Commission, that many of you, I'm sure, some of you are present in person, many of you tuned in online. And today we are kind of concluding this marathon with the civil society focus, and I think the focus is about inclusive Marshall Plan. So I would like to start with inviting one of our hosts, and this event is co-organized by the Open Society Foundations and the German Fund of the United States. I would like to ask to connect Daniela Schwarzer, who is an executive director of Open Society Europe and Central Asia program. She's also a co-author of a brand new policy paper that has been just released yesterday that looks at war and peace, supporting Ukraine to prevail, rebuild, and prosper. So Daniela is joining, unfortunately, from Berlin, from the United States. She's not with us in person, but she will bring in the findings from that document back to us. Daniela, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction and for hosting the discussion for us. It's a great pleasure to know there are many people in Berlin and even more online for this important debate, which I think happens at the right moment. Of course, many of us, including think tanks, foundations, civil society organizations, invested a lot in the preparation of the events, and in particular the event yesterday and before, to discuss and really produce recommendations how the whole issue of recovery and reconstruction should be approached. And personally, I found it was very good news that the event yesterday was opened to a strong civil society presence. And I think this is the right way forward, because it is, of course, important that governments, the European Union and other public entities fund and support the recovery process, the reconstruction process, but civil society in the country is a key element, not only for the resilience of Ukraine at the moment, but very surely for the way forward as well. And the paper you have kindly mentioned, thank you for this, we produced in a co-authorship, but really drawing on more actors than there are actually names on the paper, because our colleagues in particular in Ukraine work a lot with civil society actors. The discussion, as I said, has been ongoing. So we, in a team of 4, we produced recommendations, not only for the conference yesterday, but actually for the way forward. So first, let me speak about funding and transparency of funding. I think it is of key importance, first of all, that there is a clear outlook given on the expectations that Ukraine can have on the continued funding, not only during the war, but in particular for the time afterwards. And thus it is so important, the signal of yesterday's conference, that there's a very big political commitment beyond the European Union, as we saw, thanks to the participation. And while it is now of key importance that the money committed for this year, 9 billion euros macro financial assistance from the EU side alone, is dispersed as planned, this perspective is so important. So moving ahead now, although yesterday couldn't deliver this, and that's understandable, but working towards a very clear funding plan for the future. And we know the damage by the day is still growing, but still this presents an important perspective for the country. As I mentioned, the European Union, I wish to stay on a second point, which politically is of equal importance, and that is the continued commitment to bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union and to progressing on the actual goal which Ukraine has formulated and the EU supports, and that is accession to the European Union. As we still see the war going worse, this may seem far away, but I think this is the second major political element where Europe has its continuous role to play to, first of all, reinforce the goal and also to work very practically with the country that it moves ahead, despite all the hardship that is currently still happening. Now, for the planning of recovery and reconstruction within the country, I think it is important that the donors engage very strongly with the Ukrainian government to agree on the plan, how recovery and reconstruction will actually be managed within the country. And here, it is about, obviously, prioritization, setting up procedures, identifying what the immediate needs are. But in my view, it is also very strongly, and that came through, with it in the discussions with colleagues within Ukraine, how important it is in this process also not only to hear civil society while the process is designed, but to make civil society a partner along the way. And this is a shift, I think, which still needs to be done. If we hear about consultations as they happened in the country so far, there's still room, so we hear, to improve the consultations and have a co-ownership with civil society organizations in the country. Now, let me end on a final point, which I think is of equal importance, and that is that the reform process within Ukraine moves forward. Of course, from a donor's perspective, it is evidently important that there is transparency on the question how the money is spent. So this means the fight against corruption needs to go on. But also when we think about the goal of economic recovery, it is very clear that it is of a huge importance and very difficult at war times, of course, to proceed with economic reforms, to proceed with other reforms that are or should have been on the government's agenda but are now pushed to the side. Here again, given the strains under which the country is, the economy is, and civil society is, of course, I think the importance to make it a common effort with full ownership of civil society is of primary importance. I think if we think about that package, the political support and financial support from the donors, the work with the Ukrainian government to put in place the mechanisms to work on the recovery plan, to actually make it possible that the money is well spent and that it is spent in a way that Ukraine's future is designed in a participatory way, then I think the progress moves forward. I wish to mention one last point, and that is seizing assets that actually should flow into the funding of Ukraine's recovery. I think this remains also a huge task, not only for the European Union, it's a task in the transatlantic relationship to move forward in the thinking how the money that, because of sanctions, for instance, on Russian assets, can be seized, how this can be used for Ukraine's recovery. I wish to end there, and I thank everyone for being there, and in particular our partners from the German Marshall Fund that we set up this event together, and I'm very much looking forward to our joint debate.
Thank you very much, Daniela. We wish you were here with us. There's much to discuss, and obviously you've really set the scene from everything from funding to the way funding is spent to the way civil society and private sector can meaningfully contribute to Ukraine's recovery. And I'm really pleased we have Heather Connolly with us, who is the president of the United States, so the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Heather was yesterday also with me at the conference, and she was moderating the opening a session with the experts actually looking at the lessons learned from the old Marshall Plan, how to adapt and what is relevant. And the German Marshall Plan also proposed its way of designing Ukraine's recovery in the spirit. And I like that, in the spirit, because, you know, history can just inspire us. We cannot just copycat something that has been done over 50 years ago today. So Heather, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And Daniela, you and I switched. You're in Washington and I'm in Berlin, but with great gratitude to our partners at OSF, that we share the commitment of making sure that civil society remains a key pillar of Ukraine's recovery effort. I just wanted to reinforce why by the German Marshall Fund is so engaged in this effort. And it's simply because our full name, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a living memorial to the Marshall Plan. So we have as one of our core tasks to make sure that we are the keepers of the flame of the important lessons of the Marshall Plan. So I have to tell you, it was music to my ears yesterday hearing Chancellor Scholz, President von der Leyen, key leaders saying, we need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, a modern, inclusive Marshall Plan for Ukraine. So what we wanted this event to do, I think three things. Number one, we thought this was a great opportunity to come right after the heels of the expert conference to sort of dive deeply into the impressions, what we learned, what was said, what was not said, what was there, what was missing, to again refocus this conversation on the centrality of civil society and Ukraine's full recovery and reconstruction, and then finally, next steps. We have to keep pushing. We have to be very ambitious in making sure that the ambitions that the Chancellor and the President very eloquently stated yesterday, that there are actions following those up, that those wonderful words have concrete steps. So what I thought I would do very briefly before we turn this over is just to give you my very brief impressions from the conference. And I completely agree. First, even before the conference began, you could feel there is a new alignment between Germany and Ukraine on this issue. And yesterday's conference came on the day when President Steinmeier visited Kyiv. And so I think this is a resetting of the Ukrainian-German relationship, which I think is important. And you could feel that the European Union and Berlin were now very much in lockstep about focusing on Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery. This was fantastic. Equally, and I mentioned this to the ambassador before we began, the Ukrainian delegation was extraordinarily prepared. They had slides, their catchphrases from martial law to the Marshall Plan, the financial figures, the statistics, they came very well prepared. And I think this is really important because it gives us confidence, and it also gives, I believe, the like-minded countries a big push. We've got to catch up. They have important plans. What are our plans? What is our vision? I think exactly to Daniela's point, we heard specific numbers, the EU macroeconomic assistance. This was really important. It was particularly important for Washington policymakers that have kept saying, we've really made our contribution. Where's Europe's contribution right now? And that was a really important signal to say we are making this commitment on macroeconomic assistance, and hopefully Katerina can tell us more about this rapid recovery, some of this emergency assistance, bridging the emergency needs now to the longer-term recovery. What was missing? The United States was missing at this conference. There was not a senior U.S. government official, which I think that was a missed opportunity to make sure that this is a strong transatlantic project. What was missing? A strong civil society voice, not being invited a little late to the game, but being at that core. That was missing. So we have a chance now, as we move towards next year's London conference and all the steps in between, to make sure we have a strong U.S. voice in here to make this a transatlantic initiative. We make sure that civil society is fully engaged. The final announcement, and I think the big news, and then I'll pass this back over, was this announcement of a coordination mechanism, which is, again, the Marshall Plan had a fantastically strong American coordination mechanism. This will be different now. But there was confusing terms. So our Ukrainian colleagues were talking about a Ramstein contact group, a financial contact group. So when I think of a Ramstein group, I think about the American Secretary of Defense sort of being a leadership role in organizing with NATO and partners a big contribution, which has been extremely successful. When I hear coordination mechanism here, I'm hearing a G7 plus international financial institutions, other partners, a secretariat potentially from the Commission to help information sharing and coordination. So I think we still have to figure out exactly how that works, what that means, how it stood up, hopefully by the end of the year. But there was some progress made yesterday, and more progress than Lugano. So I think that's encouraging, but we have a long way to go, and this is where we're so grateful for our partnership with OSF, because we have to continue to push for action, for clarity, but I think it was a good day yesterday, and I know today's conversation is going to be even better. So let me turn that over to you.
Thank you very much. You're right, there was also a very strong sense of urgency of funding. Ukrainian government was saying we need funds now because the difficult winter is coming, the infrastructure is destroyed, 30% of Ukrainian grid is shattered, and they of water stations, that mobile water stations that are needed. And then I think when we are discussing specifically now the inclusion and the role of civil society, it's important for us to understand, are we talking about the rapid recovery now and what civil society can do? Are we talking about this kind of a bit midterm scenario where we have some engine of funding already in place and there is a specific role for civil society? I think that's why sometimes we can conflate it together and it starts being difficult to disentangle it. But I'm really pleased that we have excellent speakers. So our first panel contributing today, which is Oleksiy Makiev, the first time ever making a public appearance on stage, and I'm really pleased, and congratulations on starting your assignment in such a critical, country for Ukraine, Berlin. Welcome. Welcome to Berlin. A very experienced diplomat working a lot on sanctions and already being in Berlin before with the embassy. And also Katerina Maternova, who is the Deputy Director General of the Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations. I think that and enlargement negotiation is particularly important now for Ukraine, as we've heard a lot yesterday, that recovery and enlargement, future membership has to go hand in hand. And I would like to start with Ambassador and ask him to reflect on, given the importance of participation and, civil society already participates in Ukrainian recovery effort, from supplying units on the battlefield to helping, families affected by war. It's not that it's something in the future, it's a reality of Ukraine's home front. That's why Ukraine is able to be resilient. And how do you see that we can ensure the continuation of that and maybe even deepening that engagement of civil society? What do you hear maybe from where you are on that front, Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Orisa. Indeed, this is the first days on the assignment as ambassador. First 2 visits, first delegation in the first week, and then first public appearance. I'm still hesitant when my first interview would come out and blow the whole things up here in Germany, but I think this weekend you can expect it. I was on the receiving line of both delegations and missed practically completely both business forum and yesterday conference accompanying Prime Minister and other ministers. But I heard recollections of the delegation and those words of my countrymen and colleagues here. So I came to this event actually without presentation, without sound bites, without figures. So according to Heather, I'm absolutely unprepared. But instead of this, I have a story to tell. I've been deployed here in Berlin at the beginning of 2005, immediately after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And the first event I ever visited in the first or second week of my tenure here in Berlin was Kiewer Gespräche. So a purely civil society event And the people were looking at me, who's the guy from the embassy? He should be the bad guy there, because we don't know who is he representing. Actually, the old Yanukovych, the old guard, or the new one. And they were suspicious, and I came and said, you know, have you heard about the revolution of Ukrainian diplomats? Oh yes, we heard 500 diplomats express themselves against Yanukovych. I said I went as one of 7 diplomats. I went to the stage of Yushchenko, then protesting against those failures of the government to hold good and democratic elections. For me as a foreign diplomat, I represent not only the president, the government, and Verkhovna Rada. I represent all Ukrainians. And the civil society is something which is that Ukrainian civil society is something that is that easy to represent, because I would say for decades, you are not only asked to be involved, you build what modern Ukraine is all about. So I'm absolutely sure that in Ukraine we already have created those needed instruments to get the civil society on board. Well, actually, no law would pass through the parliament without the legislator talking to civil society, going on the special procedure to get approval by civil society, or to get at least profound discussions with the civil society. Moreover, in the history of our country, the representatives of civil societies are brave enough to take responsibility and to go into government and to take positions. And we have a number of cases where it led to complete success. So it's easy to represent my country, which is fighting for freedom, fighting for independence. It's really great that we can count on our civil society, and even on my recent position as a sanctioned man in the Ukrainian government. I don't know what I would have done if for example, Kiev School of Economics, representative of Ukrainian think tanks, and volunteers just stayed aside. No, they contributed a lot into the forming of a policy. And this is something which I would say is in my DNA as ambassador and in the DNA of a modern Ukrainian government. So please be sure, this is what we need, this is what we count on. And taking into consideration really great line yesterday of the President of Commission about the role of civil society, I would say, you know, we are absolutely on the same page. We're talking the same language. And I tweeted this morning the picture of the German presidency flag, German flag, Ukrainian flag, and the European Union flag standing in the premises of the conference. And this is something that natural to me, that I feel absolutely home. I, as a representative of Ukraine, feel involved, and I absolutely sure that this feeling is shared by my countrymen, civil society, journalists, and everybody in Ukraine fighting for freedom, for independence, and for prosperity of the whole Euro-Atlantic structures and continents and people and the area. So you are absolutely in the right hands.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think it's quite also striking that we have a new generation, you know, of government, the new generation that is coming with new experience formed during those civic uprisings that were quite successful uprisings if you take a look at the history of the region. but also that most recent revolution of dignity was driven for Ukraine to join that European Union that is now becoming not just a distant, dream, but something that can be tangibly implemented over time. And I think that gives Ukrainian civil society a strong anchor, and Ukrainian government also a strong anchor to push towards in the right direction for that good governance we all want to have in place. So I would like now to invite Katerina to actually reflect on how you see the donors, the funders, the European Union could anchor this participatory recovery in Ukraine, because you know Ukrainians always ask for more, especially civil society, conditionality, more pressure on the government to make sure that things don't sidetrack or don't move too slowly. We understand that it's circumstances of war. We understand that there's a need for speed right now. So what are your key takeaways specifically on that from yesterday's discussion and the way forward?
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I was able to stay in Berlin longer, which is always a treat. And hello to Daniela, who is in DC, and we don't have a chance to meet in person. You started with the introduction that I'm a Deputy Director General in DGNIR. For the last 2.5 years, I've actually had two hats, two jobs. We're saving money in the Commission this way. And I have been heading the support group for Ukraine, which is a task force that was created for Ukraine after the Maidan revolution to be able to support Ukraine on the reform path that was already charted out through the association agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade area. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because now Ukraine is a candidate country to the European Union. I was delighted to hear Chancellor Scholz yesterday to say very clearly that the future of Ukraine is in the European Union. That was very, very good to hear. And I explained to people who are not the connoisseurs of the enlargement process that Ukraine, unlike the countries, I come from Slovakia, so unlike the countries that started negotiations after the Berlin Wall fell, Ukraine is not starting from scratch, because the association agreement and the DCFTA actually put a tremendous number of reforms on Ukraine's shoulders. There has been immense reform effort that has taken place over the last 8 years, and there has been really a transformation of the country. Fundamentally, it's a different country than it was at the end of the Yanukovych regime. And I think part and parcel of that is the civil society. The story of Ukrainian transformation is the story of civil society, non-governmental organizations, think tanks, service providers. You know, the messy part, the grassroots democratic part of a society. And I think that this is really the story of Ukraine. And so I always tell everybody, sure, the proximate cause for the granting of the association, of the candidate status is the war, because the war is the factor that generated the necessary unanimity in the European Union to grant the candidate status. But the reason that they were, the basis on which the candidate status was granted were the reform measures that Ukraine and the transformation that has taken place. And I think this is extremely important to keep repeating, and especially in this country where the narrative, the Russian narrative that defined the view of Ukraine, oh, it's so corrupt country, it's practically a failed state, is extremely strong still. And there is nothing more untrue than that. If it was such a failed state as the narrative goes, as the impression that people have, it would have fallen like a house of cards. like some intelligence agencies predicted, that the regime in Kiev will survive a week. and so I think that the story of Ukraine and the building of the strength is a story of civil society and the initial weakness of institutions. And we worked very, very, very hard together with the other international community and the civil society and the IFIs to push and develop the strength of institutions. And we all had doubts, and there were still, and this, and corruption, and the number of, if you do search Ukraine and corruption, it's ridiculous how these two words are intertwined. And I must say that the strength of the institutions and the strength of the state that we are now witnessing in Ukraine during the war surprised positively even me. So you had the civil society very strong, the state had to really reform and build up, and during the war it came of age. So suddenly I teach a course on the East and on actually institution building, and I was always saying they were out of whack. The civil society was stronger and the state institutions were only getting only growing up. And now I think that in a post-war era, we are suddenly going to have both strong, which will bring another set of challenges. I have absolutely no doubt. But one of the elements that we wanted to really and have been supporting Ukraine is by not financing the civil society, but really investing in. I mean, I led an effort with few colleagues for several years to really change the way the civil society is supported by DG NIR. So we completely, we moved into supporting institutional grants, supporting, spreading the financing also outside of the capital, on granting, so they're actually, you wouldn't have to have robustness to fill our incredibly onerous reporting requirements to get our money, because when I first came, I realized that only civil society organizations that don't need our money can get them, essentially, because if you have the robustness that is able to work with our accountability rules, then you probably don't need the money. So I think we have successfully, I hope that you will confirm that. I think we have really started 5 years ago this process, and I think we are doing better. I mean, we are not as flexible as some private donors, obviously, but having civil society participate is absolutely fundamental for us. And I think that for the reconstruction process, and this is what the President von der Leyen said yesterday as her first point of comments was, there was a historian, Professor Macmillan, in the proceedings yesterday, who said that there were independent experts embedded in ministries that were supervising or looking after the implementation of the initial Marshall Plan. And I think it's the civil society in Ukraine that is well placed to play this role, because it has...
It reminds me of these reform offices that existed after 2013-14, after the Revolution of Dignity, where there were dedicated teams to actually also help draft reforms. Yeah. So there was already an experience of actually embedding something within various ministries. But if I may, sorry, I just want to connect to a specific question that we received from Ukrainian civil society joining us now online, whether there could be a conditionality from donors before you commit funding to ensure that there is a participation, or you leave it to Ukrainian civil society and government to come up with an arrangement.
I think we will definitely insist on that, and just like even already with the association agreement, we have civil society platforms that we support. As to the robustness of presentation yesterday, I think for our taste, there could have been a little more. I understand the venue was limited, perhaps a bigger venue could have been found. So I think that the participation and the vibrancy of the civil society is really key to the success of the effort. And as the ambassador mentioned, and welcome in Germany, the government, you know, you may like it or not, but the government is very used to dealing with the watchdog functions, because at the same time, as you mentioned at the beginning, I forget it's a complicated name of the group of think tanks and NGOs at the beginning that.
Coalition?
Not RISE, the reform, the reanimation package, the reanimation
yes, the
package,
chorus.
that when the new government after Maidan didn't have the capacity, it was the think tanks that brought in. This is very much what we had done into 1998 in the Slovak government context after we voted out the evil ex-prime minister from Mečiar from the office. So this is how you work. This is how you go in and out, and you support the capacity overall.
Okay, well, fantastic. I would like to then to change a bit the flow, if you don't mind, and then invite you to join the first row in panel 2 that is coming from civil society to basically continue a conversation and share their feedback, what they have heard. So I would like to invite on stage Alexandra Sushko, who is the director of Renaissance Foundation, which is the Office of Open Societies Foundations Network in Kyiv. Alexandra, please join here. So we'll do a bit of a swapping. And then we will have Alexandra Betli, who is the leading researcher from the Institute of Economic Research and Policy Consulting. She will join us online. And then the third speaker will be Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, who is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Berlin office at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So let's give a round of applause to our first session. And welcome our second session. And I think we will be able to carry on the conversation after the 2 panels, also in the reception later on, because I'm sure there are plenty of questions to carry on. This is just giving again the outline of what is there to expect. So thanks again to government and officials to present how they see and how they actually value the engagement of civil society. And now I would like to turn to Alexandra, who is tuning in from Kyiv. Great to have you with us. You have been looking actually at the resilience of Ukrainian economy and how Ukrainian society is coping with the war. When you hear this discussion and you see what is going on in preparation for the reconstruction, what are your thoughts that you would like to bring back to the panel today here in Berlin? Alexandra, over to you.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to participate in this event after yesterday's discussions in Berlin. Actually, I would like to say that I would like to agree with Heather, who said that yesterday it was a bit kind of a frustration that civil society wasn't really presented during the event and during the discussions, even though in the end, Ursula von der Leyen said that civil society in Ukraine is really vibrant and it's a benefit of Ukrainian government during the reconstruction. Our institute is a part of a consortium of 4 organizations, and we called our consortium as a resilience, reconstruction and relief for Ukraine. And here the topic is that resilience comes the first. Our government thought that it is resilient, our economy and business and civil society appear to be resilient, and therefore we would like to start now the talks about reconstruction, about recovery, emergency recovery, etc. And here our consortium developed several principles of the recovery that we would like everybody just to join and have it in mind when we discuss principles of finances, principles of spending money, as well as principles of fundraising, I would say. And among these principles, I would name only a few now, and one is ownership. Our consortium really thinks that ownership should be held by Ukraine. So Ukraine should be an owner of the process, of the vision how to build Ukraine. It should be also defining the priorities. And when I'm talking about Ukraine here, then another principle is people-centered, so human-centered approach for reconstruction. And here we include this inclusive process of reconstruction, where local governments play a major role as well, and civil society is there. And when we talk about civil society role, it is important to say that civil society can create some principles. It can be involved in the preparation of and discussions of the approaches, how to coordinate assistance, how to advocate. And the civil society in Ukraine also plays a role of this capacity building that you have mentioned, basically. So we are ready to stand for that. We are ready to stand for advocacy, for capacity building. And we are also ready to be watchdogs. So it's not only the function of civil society to be a watchdog, but also kind of creating senses for recovery, creating visions for recovery of Ukraine. And when we talk about transparency, I would like to say that it's really important that the whole process of fundraising as well as fund spending should be transparent, as much transparent as possible, and basically it should be transparent. We should understand where money comes from and how they are spent. And here I would like to say that our small consortium is a part of bigger one, which is, I've heard its name during the discussion, RISE. And RISE is advocating currently on the creation of digital reconstruction management system. And this is basically a system of transparent procedures of recovery financing. So we talk about that on the electronic system, which is similar to Prozoro. Prozoro is translated, if somebody doesn't know, as transparent. So it should be a system where we see what is financed, what reconstruction is done, who is spending money, and what is the result. Here I would like to stop, and probably you will have more questions about it.
Fantastic, Alexandra. I think there's nothing that really contradicts in what you say with the Lugano principles that were declared this summer, and it all includes transparency, multi-stakeholder engagement. It's just unpacking it, and from what we hear from you is that there's already development in place for the smart data portal that will enable, making right decision based on the correct data, which is very important, but also making it transparent from the start to the end, and that Ukrainian civil society is ready to be both the watchdog but also the implementer of some of depending on the profile of the organization. So there is a real good capacity within the sector to really build this inclusive recovery. So fantastic, and thanks for this update. So I'd like now to turn to Thomas, because you know the kind of European policy making scene, and you have knowledge of the old Marshall Plan and how assistance was delivered. So when you hear this, what is being proposed by officials, what Ukrainian civil society demands, do you see the positions merging and something interesting will come out of this, or do you see some risks, perhaps, what we should be, aware of?
Well, yesterday, I think, represents an important moment, and it is the arrival of Ukraine in the minds of all the other Europeans as part of the family. I thought that was one of the most striking observations about yesterday, was not just the quote, although that was really important, that Katarina Martinova quoted from Chancellor Scholz, future of Ukraine is in the EU. It was that feeling that there is a destiny here and a certainty about the destiny that everybody embraced. So the first point I would make, but we have in the title of this event, we have the name inclusion. It's the inclusion of Ukraine. The second is about who to, the second question is who to include. Is it Ukraine, the country, or Ukraine as a society? And I think in her remarks at the end of the conference, President von der Leyen made this pretty clear when she made a commitment and also a recognition of the role of civil society in this process for Ukraine. And that was an important moment as the conference was wrapping up, as we were moving to a second stage. The next stage is for civil society to be a partner on. It wasn't yesterday, and for a couple of reasons that I'll get to, but it will be. And the commitment was there. So the first was the certainty about Ukraine, and the second was about the inclusion of civil society. Now, I should make a couple of observations about the importance of the day yesterday. I think my most important observation is that the last 10 days of bombing by Vladimir Putin has changed the mindsets. I think people have understood that we're in a long war, and the sense of urgency has changed the platform, has changed the game. And that has resulted in a little bit of a different setup. First of all, I think the commitment of the 18 billion of macrofinancial assistance is key. And it doubles the commitment of the EU from this year, and it creates predictability. Secondly, they're working on emergency aid. Emergency aid it is about surviving this winter. We can talk about inclusion, and we can talk about civil society all we want, and I'm all for that, but it is about surviving this winter, and I thought that atmosphere and the instrument was translated into instruments, and that only on a third element is reconstruction itself, and the planning and the financing. We also saw some progress on the platform issue. The European Union made its commitment to building a secretariat. The international financial institutions, the term inclusion showed up there as well, that they are building an inclusive structure. Leadership is unclear. I think you can get that done by the end of the year. So financing, emergency help, platform, the remaining question of leadership can be figured out by the end of the year. If you put these together, yesterday was representing progress. I want to make one remark about, if you allow, about Russian assets, and then what does partnership in civil society, what does that mean? President von der Leyen made the remark on the stage that that the Commission is not looking at the inclusion of Russian assets into reconstruction on a neutral basis. It wants to include them. So this is not, we'll look into this, we want to solve this problem, we came out with that commitment. In our report that you all have on your chairs, we're cautious about the realism of that. I need to warn people against the idea that Russian assets will be an immediate answer to the financing problems that we see. There is a rule of law question, but there is also a political question as to the nature of the international financial system, and it will be especially hard in the United States because the dollar-based system, the idea that this type of precedent could be an own goal and could undermine the primacy of the dollar is a big concern, not only of lawmakers, but of the financial community and the financial administration in the United States and elsewhere in the Western countries. So I would warn against the idea that this is an immediate solution. Last point about civil society. Some good things have been said here. I think the term that Heather Conley quoted, from martial law to the Marshall Plan, that really has, that means something. I think we're seeing a country that under martial law and under war condition is being centralized to the degree that a civil and peaceful society is usually not. So the first step of inclusion will be to get to a more normal status back in Ukraine. And the second, therefore, will be the diversification of whatever help will be channeled towards Ukraine, and that means to local communities and local actors. Also by way of other European partner cities. I was sitting next to a person who was looking forward to working with Ukrainian community. So I do believe that the inclusion of business, the inclusion of city to city, community to community, and finally of mechanisms of civil society inclusion, whether you embed them in the process or, as we have suggested in our report, to have a microfinance system so that especially in the regions, especially in those local areas that are remote, smaller local groups can participate in ways that they usually couldn't. That to me looks like a way forward.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think that from what you said and from what we've heard yesterday, that it's likely to be the multi-layered process, right? I mean, this is something also to understand. It's unlikely be just one pot or one recovery engine at this point, because it seems like the need for coordination that was voiced yesterday, and it seems like we are moving on it, will exactly enable that multi-layer deliveries through IFIs, international financial institutions, through government microfinancial assistance, that is a completely different vehicle, and through private foundations like Open Society foundations. Shouldn't they be included as well in a donor coordination mechanism if they are investing in what I would call soft recovery, human capital, sustaining, educational systems, services to IDPs, reintegrating youth that is affected by war. So there's something to think about. It's quite a complex architecture that will be emerging. Yeah, sure.
I don't want to. This reconstruction process, I think, will be different from other ones in the sense that, when you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, other places, in Western countries, it was seen as a necessity and as a government task. Yeah. What you have now with Ukraine, there is commitment and excitement by civil societies and by the philanthropic community here. Yeah. Therefore, I think your point is really well taken, that a vehicle needs to be created to channel that engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we can discuss it further on. If Katerina would like to chip in, you'll have to come on stage here. You can, please come over here, because you need to give your microphone. You will not be visible for the live stream, that's why. Apologies, I know, but just for you to be visible for the online audience.
No, just to comment on what Thomas just said, I very much agree what you said, that there is excitement and commitment of civil society that we need to harness, and that's going to make the reconstruction of Ukraine different. But it's going to be completely different for other reasons. And again, it's important to remember that. I get a little bit nervous when I hear Afghanistan's and Iraq's mentioned, because let's face it, this is going to be the first reconstruction since the Second World War in an industrialized country where the government works. This is not a failed state. So all the discussions on what was and wasn't done in Afghanistan properly only go so far. The strength of the civil society is part of it, but let's remember, the government works. The government works at the central level, the decentralization, there's not a single mayor of a Hromada that has fled. So it wasn't only unlike the Afghani president, it wasn't only Mr. Zelensky who said, I need arms, not a lift. But at the local level, that was the case as well. So I think fundamentally it's the whole of Ukraine, the government, national, subnational, and the civil society that are working, and that's going to make the reconstruction very different, and the examples of the recent or more distant past go only so far.
You're right, you're absolutely right. And thanks for making that specific distinctions on local capacity to deliver, to provide solutions, to local problems, because Ukrainians know best how to recover their communities from this horror of war. And that's why I'm happy I could bring in Alexander. And Alexander, they are supporting a range of actors. Already they are supporting them to sustain in times of war across all regions of Ukraine. And I think that Alexander, especially with his experience of being so long in civil society, will be able to tell us, again, how do you see, based on strengths of Ukrainian civil society, how do we best plug in and contribute? In practical terms, if you have some specific suggestions.
Thank you. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. And this is a big pleasure for me to come to Berlin this time, which is a little bit extraordinary in many senses. But it's really valuable visit. And I think that Orisa just reminded me that my personal professional profile includes different works in the civil society, including think tanks, and also in the international, global civil society, and also now in the donors community. This is really helpful to understand what kind of the synergy may appear at the connection point of various actors involved, including certainly the government. So I think that, first of all, our point that civil society should be engaged does not necessarily mean that we are just fighting for the chair, fighting for the seat at the table. It is not this way, because this is not about some quotas to vote. This is because this practice also sometimes exists, sometimes it's good or bad, but it's a formal engagement. And certainly at each point we can find such normative ways of engagement when, for example, it is mandatory that some civil society entities should be a part of some process. But our approach is not about this so much. So this is not about formal engagement. I think that our experience of last 8 months gives us a lot of knowledge when it comes to the real capacities, real ambitions, real interests, the civil society entities to be part of this, what we call now recovery. It is not, it is bigger than recovery, because sometimes it started from the very first days of the war with the assistance to immediately suffering people. The efforts of the civil society group helping to relocate people from the most affected zones. Then it was a work to deliver some immediate needed goods to the medical facilities, to the hospitals, to the various forms of voluntary work. And then certainly it moved forward towards what we now call recovery and reconstruction, meaning that there are a variety of civil society actors with different tools, which are not just asking for the seat, but which are really doing very visible job. Sometimes it's visible on the very local level. So sometimes it goes to the to the local communities, where, for example, there is a need to absorb a big number of IDPs. There is a need to build some new facilities for some elderly people, people with children, other group the most suffered from the war. And the civil society is quite visible on this front line. And I am happy to be a part of the foundation which is capable to reach that level. Because the most of the big donors, they do a lot of great job, I mean, the other donor community. But we have a privilege to reach the lowest possible level where there are small NGOs are operating on the local level, helping people. And also at the same time, we are quite present on the higher level when, for example, think tanks are working in order to elaborate some policies or advocate some legal acts or suggest some scenarios of renovation work. There are some groups of urbanists, there are different kind of activists working across the country who have something in mind, who have an expertise, who have ambitions, who have some courage and authority. Fortunately, we have sometimes, not in all the cases, but in many cases, we have an opportunity to help them. And now we have already the products available. I think that among the 400 plus projects which the foundation supported since the beginning of the war, probably at least 100 is some way connected to the process which we call recovery. Again, from the very basic needs on the local level, restoring some school or medical facility in the village, until the very high level, well-established people who are working on the policy plans, policy planning. And all these levels are really needed. So what we are arguing is not about future. It's about the reality which is already on the ground. Certainly this is our message to the rest of the donors community. So let's do not think that because usually people say that recovery is something which goes after the end of the war. But this is not the case. Certainly some elements may be provided only after the end of the war, but the most of them already badly needed. And you already mentioned the urgent need of delivering critical services, for example, to people before the winter and during the winter, which will be harsh. And certainly there are a lot of work to be done on liberated areas, huge areas in the north of Ukraine, Kiev region, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv. There are lots of work to be done, and there are lots of efforts to be supported already now. And it's quite possible. So my message is that there are there is a huge spectrum of real examples of civil society engagement already in place. Certainly, I would not idealize all this. Sometimes we deal with people with a certain lack of competence, and this is a job of the foundation to identify who is really capable and who is sometimes not enough. But that is why we need these filters as expert boards who take decisions, for example, or the well-qualified commissions to identify those who are really capable. So this is our job.
What you are saying, what is interesting is that you could say you already have a certain laboratory of recovery.
Yes.
That you are seeding projects and you already see what could work, what couldn't work, that you can later feed in on scale, for example, once there is this bigger facility in place, that, you know, you could basically solve issues. You tried something, you piloted it, you know that it's working, and maybe now it's a good time, you know, to experiment if you want. And this is what private foundations are good at. They are not spending, so to say, taxpayers' money. You in a way have more freedom to fail, in the good sense, which means you have a freedom to try. Would you agree?
Thank you for this for this analysis. Yes, certainly we are hoping not to fail, but certainly lots of experiments.
Yes.
And sometime we deal in the normal life. We had more time to check every initiative. Now it's certainly because of the urgency. Sometimes we take risks to invest and to support some projects when the people behind are not well known. We just don't know, and we have some time either to trust or not trust. So we take these risks. Fortunately, the most of the projects, I think they are quite effective. But certainly this requires significant administrative resources on the side of the donor, because it requires a lot of administrative work with these small and medium grants. And I may tell you that the foundation has already released more grants under the war condition this year than usually in the peaceful time. We will probably have, in the end of the year, we will likely have at least 30% plus number of grants as compared to the peaceful time, taking into account that the people were in very difficult conditions, especially in the beginning of war. So this is, I'm proud of our team.
So it's great that you could be so adaptive and fast. And I would like just to remind our audience that you could send your questions. I mean, this is for the email that was mentioned, berlin.events@opensocietyfoundations, in plural.org. So just if you have anything that comes up to your mind, and I've seen, you have to email the questions. We work in this kind of digital format, but I've seen Ambassador's hand to comment on if you could just also come to stage, because for the online audience to see, yeah.
Thank you. A short comment. I'd like to support the message of Alexander that actually time to invest into recovery, reconstruction and renovation is now. And this is one of the most important messages which I think was a bit lost yesterday during the conference. And I have a perfect example what it means for Ukrainians. Just imagine a crossroads downtown Kiev, or this place for children to play, a playground, children's playground in the center of Kiev. The way Ukrainians reacted to that is not to wait until those shellings would end, wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. No, Ukrainians renovated the crossroads the next day. And this is the way of recovery, renovation, and I would not exclude that all the next renovation would be made of a higher quality than it was before. And this is the approach of Ukrainian to invest into building an absolutely new country with your assistance and, of course, with the assistance of the civil society. Thank you.
Actually, it's a perfect segue, because I will want to bring in Alexandra, who is with us on the line from Kiev, something that is about now, the Ukrainian business community and Ukrainian economy now, because this is, at this point, the biggest donor to Ukrainian budget, to Ukrainian war effort, it's Ukrainian economy. And when you look at the state of Ukrainian economy, especially small and medium companies, we do know that the survey on DIA, which is a digital website, when they surveyed businesses, how many of them are involved in supporting Ukrainian home front and war effort, 95% of companies said one way or the other, we are contributing for Ukrainian resistance. So you could see that they are not just paying taxes, keeping jobs, they're also contributing. And this is would be great to hear from you, Alexandra, how you see what kind of assistance would be needed to keep Ukrainian economy going beyond microfinancial assistance that we hear from the European Commission and IFI is providing. Do you have any specific suggestions coming up from your consortium?
When we talk about Ukrainian economy, just several figures. According to estimate of the institute, real GDP declined by 37% in September. And overall, in this year, we expect that it will decline by 32% or something like that. But it will all depend on the Russian selling of our energy infrastructure. So pretty much currently, and as I said, first R in the name of our consortium is resilience. And then Thomas also talked about this survival. We really need to survive at the moment and to be resilient. And for this, we need assistance of international community with generators, with energy transformators, etc. And this is required not only, it's not required by the government, it's required by the people and by the business as well. And I can explain why. Business needs working force, and people will stay in Ukraine if they can survive through this difficult winter, if they will have access to hospitals, and therefore our hospitals need the generators. If children will be in school online or, offline, it doesn't matter, but then the schools need the generators as well. And this is kind of what we need at the moment. This is kind of a first urgent need for our resilience, this assistance of energy equipment, I would say so. Then we come to the point of financial assistance, and the problem for Ukraine is that as GDP, as I mentioned, it's dropped tremendously. What we see is a decline in tax revenues of the government, and currently, but still our business do pay taxes. However, part of this tax comes from a so-called inflationary tax. So our people do pay inflationary tax, which brings some more revenues to the budget, but it hurts purchasing power of our households. But these tax revenues currently are only covering only half of what we need for financing only priority spending of the government. And almost half of spending is the military spending, which we do cover by these taxes. And another part is covered by our international partners, United States at the first place. And when we talk about international assistance, again, we need it just because, for example, United States assistance was directed and allocated for paying social payments, for payment of pensions. And then the Institute ran the survey of industrial companies, and we see from the survey that companies that create products and services for the domestic market, like food industry and light industry, they feel much better than others. And one of the reasons is that the government has this priority to pay pensions in time, to pay social benefits, to pay wages, and our business also pay wages. So currently, this is important to help our companies to survive as well, to keep them working, especially in those industries which are directed on the domestic demand driven. So, and when we talk about international assistance, then the problem is that we receive it, but it's not predictable, it's not regular, so we cannot really judge when the assistance will come. And I would like to react on what Thomas mentioned today, is that yesterday Ursula von der Leyen said that we will receive, that she is currently in negotiations with EU members on these 18 billion of euros. So negotiations are not finalized yet. So we don't have kind of heavy commitments, tight commitments that this money will come and when we will receive them. But we really would like to have this, like, that European Union commits that it will give us 1.5 billion euros, and then United States also mentioned that it will give us $1.5 billion. This actually covers the gap that we have in our budget. And again, why we need to cover this gap in a predictable way is that the government needs this money to pay not only social benefits and wages and finance healthcare and education, but also to refund VAT to business. One of the impediments to the development of business, which we see from the Institute's survey of business, is that they lack liquidity. And here then we come to the point that VAT refunds is a liquidity for the government, for the business, and therefore we want to see this liquidity back. So the government has this opportunity and chances to refund VAT in proper time. Also, another issue for what we need for our business from international partners, it's cooperation. And here we come to the point that we really need private business to come to Ukraine from European countries, from United States, etc. But then I would like to underpin what was said yesterday also during Berlin conference, that reconstruction comes again with our way towards European Union, and here we come for reforms. Therefore, we really need this kind of continuation of decentralization, and here it's really important to ensure that our local governments have strong capacity, and probably some technical assistance from international donors could be provided to local governments to have this capacity to work with business, to work with the private business of other countries, to work with international donors. On the other hand, we need to continue and finally complete the judicial reform, and our anti-corruption institutions have already started working, so they have to continue working. So it all goes to in pair, and we just need kind of more assistance, probably, like in the form of the budget support to the government, in form of private investors. Private investments, like foreign private investments, will come to Ukraine, especially under condition if there is war insurance. And I would still think that war insurance should be provided by, again, international partners. There are already discussions and some commitments by MIGA, World Bank insurance company, I would say so, institution. And also we need kind of private companies to come here to be insured that they have some guarantees, taking into account that the war continues and there are some risks in Ukraine.
Thank you, Alexandra. I think you really outlined much more than, just civil society, but Ukraine's economy, because if Ukraine relies on, its own capabilities and printing hryvnias, we may, fall into hyperinflation that will make it much more costly in the future to rebuild Ukraine. So hopefully that coordination mechanism...
Just to say this, yes. In June, for example, we didn't receive all money which were promised to Ukraine. After in April, IMF verified the need of $5 billion per month. We have received almost nothing in June, and therefore NBU was forced to print money heavily. It increased discount rate to 25%. And this printing money really leads to kind of really huge vulnerabilities on the foreign exchange market and hyperinflation. Therefore, we would like to kind of keep it.
That not only Ukraine has to fight, but it also has to finance the war at the very, high risks. And it's interesting, perhaps also something to think about for the private sector and companies with the capital. Ukraine has a very vibrant IT sector, and people from Ukraine, young people, are now working both outside, but they are supplying their families with remittances at home, and there could be possible financial venture fund to support such Ukrainian startups, even at times of war, dedicated. It could be a blended, sovereign state and private capital that would actually continue that cash flows back into Ukrainian banking system to support families. I mean, we have to really be creative instead of just build on Ukrainian strengths, and clearly that IT digital economy is one of Ukrainian strengths that we could. And I've seen Thomas raising your hand when Alexandra was speaking, so I'll bring you in.
A couple of remarks responding to Alexandra here.
Maybe the microphone for the, I think for the online.
I think it's working.
Oh, you have it.
It's working. Yes, private business needs to come to Ukraine, but private business needs certainty and private business needs peace. So the assumption that they will come if the bombs are falling is optimistic. Therefore, and it does make a difference whether you're a company that's already in and is keeping up their business. Some of them do that, and they keep their people, and they keep operating, even if they're foreign investors. But for a foreign investor to make an investment in Ukraine under these conditions, it is very hard to expect. Which is why, and I thought Alexandra was spot on. War insurance is critical, and war insurance is something that only sovereigns can provide. You can't just go to London and buy it at Lloyd's. So that is something that has to be done in that next phase. I understand, Alexandra, your point that yesterday's 18 billion was not a firm commitment in the sense that, you know, here stands Queen Ursula and commits. She's not a queen and she's not a prime minister. This is a club of countries, and once Ukraine is part of that club, it will appreciate the fact that nation states have a word to say. The European Union can't tax, so it is simply impossible for her to make a commitment without going back to the Council. I understand the nature of the necessity of Ukraine for predictability, and that is exactly von der Leyen's point that she was trying to make, to create that predictability, have the financing needs of Ukraine being taken care of through the macroeconomic support for this year, and start early on a predictable process for next year. Final point, very good point that I thought you made is that the enormous resiliency of the Ukrainian workforce to have been keep working. You mentioned the 30+% drop in GDP. Well, it's been 40-some% predicted. It's been going up until the recent bombing. So, and that tells you how Ukrainians have just kept plugging on, and so these numbers have improved. Now, think about the fact if. And here I want to make a little plug to my own government in two little points I would like to make. If, let's say, a couple of district heating plants in Kiev were bombed tomorrow, and whole neighborhoods are being made unlivable, what are these people going to do? Well, they're going to move westward, which is exactly what Mr. Putin would like us to do. So from a German government perspective, also from Polish government perspective, what's your better investment? To wait and do nothing and wait for these people to come here, or make an investment in creating or recreating livable circumstances, which, by the way, leads to a larger point that connects to what Alexandra just said. And that is, it is much harder to reconstruct a failed state than a working state. And in order, if you then combine all the financial needs from rehabilitation and relief to humanitarian to macro-financial to weapons, what is your best investment? If you take out moral considerations, if you take out political considerations, in my book, the best financial investment, if you want to spend the lowest amount of money, it's invest in weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah. That's actually something that Olaf Scholz yesterday said, that the best recovery is the one that doesn't have to happen. And he actually started from saying that Ukraine needs also military assistance, especially the air defense systems, to protect exactly those Ukrainian critical infrastructure hubs that are being so intentionally destroyed by Russian. Katerina wanted to comment maybe on 18 billion, maybe on something else, I don't know, but she was raising her hand, and maybe you stay with us on the chair, because it's not very easy to.
Thanks a lot. Again, just to complement, very much agree that the money is needed now. I actually, for my taste, there wasn't enough of a sense of urgency yesterday. And I think my President von der Leyen made the pitch very clear, and I would very much hope that the Council of the 27 member states will be sending very rapidly positive signals, and will get it done, so we will not get into the loop of 4 months of haggling as happened with the macrofinancial assistance. So I think that's really critical, because the winter is coming. The very clear strategy of the repugnant regime to the east of Ukraine is obvious. It's killing civilians, destroying infrastructure, and terrorizing the rest of the country. And so money will be needed. The 18 billion that President von der Leyen spoke about is precisely designed to give the predictability that has been missing so far. In addition to that, we have all sorts of support programs for rehabilitation of the current infrastructure needs, etc. But one thing I would like to use the opportunity to clarify. The European Union is desperately bad at communicating. If we communicated better, we wouldn't have Brexit, for example. And so I know that the attention on what the EU has delivered and has not delivered is on the, how one makes up the 9 billion that were announced in May, where 3 billion is still missing. But in addition to that, there actually have been grants and macrofinancial assistance loans, as well as budget support from a different pot in the union's budget, that all accounted to around 12.5 billion, both loans and grants. So it's not only the 9. The 9 was the visible one, and when I was in Washington 10 days ago, I heard about that, from morning till the evening. But so there is a communication effort on our side to explain how much we have done, and we've done some fact sheets that we'll be happy to leave here. But there is certainly more effort needed, and the 18 billion commitment was very welcome. And let's hope we'll get it rapidly.
Yeah, rapidly,
done.
which brings me to Rebecca Harm's question, who is with us here in the audience, former member of European Parliament. She said, when will the first tranche of recovery and survival in the next winter be available in Ukraine? That we hope soon, right? That's the best thing we could say. It's as soon as possible.
Well, technically we are going to be ready. The rest will depend on the political agreement of the 27 and the biggest economy first and foremost.
Yeah. And I think also it's for us to also understand that this funding will go to the central budget. It will not go directly to regional or local institutions. For that, there will be other facilities, either these grants that are going through, existing European Union assistance programs. I remember you had the non-state actors kind of facility where local self-governments could apply. But just for us to be sure, we're talking about budgetary support to.
We are talking about budgetary support to keep the government running, and a certain percentage of it to go to rehabilitation of the bomb infrastructure right now. And great to see you, Rebecca. And just to clarify, from not the macrofinancial assistance part, but the support group for Ukraine budget that we work on, we, for example, to give an example, for IDP housing and reconstruction and building, we decided why go through the central government, and we actually are doing grants to cities and municipalities. And when we are talking in a civil society context, our funding for civil society tripled from the beginning of the war. There was actually quite significant money that went, because indeed, already in the first days of war, the civil society stepped up with emergency deliveries, so we were able to repurpose a lot of our funding also towards the civil society actors.
And this is a great example of how, yes, stay here. Do you have a microphone here? Yeah. So this is actually a great example how things happen on the ground, you know, these multi-track assistance facilities. So, Alexander, you wanted to comment, and then I have a question also for you from...
Exactly. So my comment is in continuation with what Katerina just said. So certainly on the big macro level, we need some big programs, big commitments. And yesterday we have heard from President von der Leyen this at least draft of these commitments, and we believe that it will work this way. But at the same time, we already have this successful story with smaller money, certainly. But sometimes it is already contributing to the recovery, when some people say that recovery is an issue of the future. I have examples of how European Union money work in the local and very local level in Ukraine for recovery purposes. Here we have our experience, and the IRF, our foundation, is a framework partner of the European Union in Ukraine. First of all, in the first days of the war, European Union agreed to change the purpose of the money which we already received at that time, in order to rechannel that into an immediate need of the local communities, in order to relocate, in order to deliver help. So that was one of the, among other partners, it was the most flexible and the fastest solution to meet immediate need.
Often.
Yes. Yes. Then it was a newly negotiated grant specifically addressed to the need of this local communities and volunteer groups. And we have already done a competition. There are winners. They already received money. And this is not Soros money. This is European Union money channeled through our foundation. And so this is an example. We have already, I think that 50 plus such grants. So I think that we have, if somebody really needs this better communication, probably we need to do it, because probably the knowledge of this kind of cooperation is not sufficient enough. But I may confirm, and many grantees may confirm. Thank you, Katerina.
That's very good, and I think that, you know, in a way there are already, as we speak, vehicles through which funds are arriving. Obviously, the main focus, because of the geography of the areas that are liberated, so to, you know, where Ukraine has reclaimed controls, is specifically Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv. This is what the minister yesterday showed us on the map, where the most destruction happened, where the risks are to, you know, to sustaining the livelihood of the people. And here's a theme that comes across both actually from Ukrainian civil society that sent their questions ahead of time, and also Wilfred Yilge, who is here in the audience with us, advisor on Ukraine from the Center of International Peace Operations. And it's about the role of communities in reconstruction. Again, so we're coming back to, you know, actually the principles of subsidiarity, if you want, in Europe, where the things should be delivered at the level with the minimum waste and the closest reach to the constituents, to the citizen. So the question is, you know, how do we really delineate between the national and regional? Is the current level of decentralization sufficient, right? Because Ukraine is already, before the war, working in a new governance paradigm, and this would, I guess, be, Alexander, to you, if you can tell us. So, for example, Wilfred has a concrete suggestion. He said how the external financial resources should be distributed in a way that they have not asked, that they don't have to ask local communities permission for the central executive, because we know Ukrainian political culture is often based on, you know, the political loyalty that you buy through finance, right? How do we avoid that reincarnation of that pattern that existed in Ukraine's political culture in the past? Because if you centralize funding, local communities have to go to central authorities, they may ask something in exchange. Do you have an answer to that, Alexander? Because you know it best, the Ukrainian political culture.
When we discussed these conceptual issues yesterday with my colleagues here, I have mentioned such a definition that Ukraine is a country of flexible rules. What does it mean? Sometimes this flexibility works for good, sometimes not for good. And, but it is a way how the society operates. This is a part of operational culture. It is neither bad or good, but this is operation, the way how people used to live. And sometimes, especially in the wartime, it is rather for good, because it gives more flexibility, more immediate capacity to react and to adjust to the changing reality, to the crisis, and to survive. So this is a very significant survival tool. At the same time, certainly, when it comes to the government, all this policy making, whatever, flexible culture sometimes contains big risks of misuse of power, of non-efficient power, of some private interests, whatever, and some sort of bureaucracy. Certainly, I do not have knowledge enough to assess what kind of bureaucracy is good and what is bad. But certainly, in Ukrainian society, there is a belief that Ukrainian bureaucracy is bad, but European bureaucracy is good. So this is something which is totally different from British, for example, belief. And I think this belief is also not fully bad or good. This is a reality, and we have to utilize it. This belief in European capacity to act. So sometimes it provides for some exaggerated expectations. So Ukrainians expect from Europe something in an idealistic way. But the issues you mentioned, so certainly concrete examples, I may not know some details, but certainly there is, I think that the way to solve these problems is public engagement. So if some problems are delivered to the public space, there is better chance to solve the problem, because the government is sensitive. The government cannot ignore if something is delivered through public space. If some powerful voices by the civil society, by international partners, are delivered openly. And so government usually cannot ignore it. So I think that this is one of the ways how to solve some particular problems.
My idea that comes to mind, again, there has been a lot of funding delivered to Ukraine previously, before the war. So we shouldn't look too much into Afghanistan. We should look actually what works and doesn't work in Ukrainian circumstances. And one, for example, idea is that there was a Ukraine Fund for Energy Efficiency that was supposed to be set up as a separate agency according to the best standards of, you know, financial instruments, with the independent and competitive grant-making process. That was difficult to get off the ground. But I think if we are talking in a spirit also of these different facilities, this could be a place where local communities can apply for funding based on clear, transparent rules that is not allocated by the executive. As an idea that could be proposed. And I think the collective brain should be put together to seek some of these Ukraine-based practices that could be rehabilitated now to serve Ukrainian recovery. Katerina.
Well, thank you for mentioning one of my babies. the
Another-
energy efficiency fund.
good.
So that's next to Max. That's the
Do you
energy
think that's a
efficiency
good,
fund is
good
my
way to carry
second baby.
forward? Yeah.
So indeed, it's been, but it's a donor-run thing. So
Okay.
we deposited money actually via IFC. So there is a side by side. It's obviously Ukrainian run, but
Co-ownership, maybe.
it's a little bit of a hybrid model. But two quick points. One is on decentralization. I mean, this I think is the most transformational reform in Ukraine. We actually invested huge amounts. We worked together with the German government and many other governments as well. And I think that the decentralization is one of the strengths, and that's the reason why we already experimented now, even during the war, with funding communities directly, which was the first time we've ever done it at this scale. And I think in the reconstruction it will continue. So, and it should continue. There are things that you need to do nationally, and there are things you can do, and I think other donors will follow that. So that's one point. And the second point, I think what was not mentioned here, and I think it's again going to make the reconstruction very, very different, is the level to which Ukraine is a digitalized country. Our president mentioned it yesterday. Apart from little Estonia, and my colleague Tanel sits here and works very hard on the IT and digitalization efforts in Ukraine and across the East, it's the most digitalized country in Europe. I mean, we are in the 19th century, whether it's your country or my country or all of the rest of the EU, compared to what we have in Ukraine now. Half of the public services would not be delivered during the war if it wasn't for the DIA application. And I have a colleague who is hosting Ukrainian family, and there's a 16-year-old who was amused in Brussels that we still get bills in an envelope. It's like, oh, envelopes, how quaint. And so I think this actually can be one of the huge propellers also of not only efficiency, but also transparency. The level to which it's digitalized, and there are new services being added on a weekly basis. And now I really am going to leave because I'm overtaking a second panel and I don't want to...
No, it's okay. You stay here. You don't have to move. It's great. I mean, I think it's good to have EU so engaged, right? This is what we all want, right? I mean, well done. I see also, I don't want to forget Alexandra, that she's with us. And then I think this is, Alexandra mentioned this new data system that is being designed with the Ministry of Digital Transformation in cooperation with the Ministry of Territorial Development to enable communities who will have to design projects, to implement projects, to run financial management of very complicated sometimes projects to enable. So I don't know if you, Alexandra, can bring any more detail about what is this tool, when is it going to be ready, and should we be investing in teaching people actually how to use this tool, right? We were doing with a lot with Prozoro and Dozoro. There's still a lot of capacity building that will be needed.
Yeah, first I would like to reflect on the previous question that decentralization is really a big transformation which took place in 2015, 2018, and therefore our local governments can basically run some projects and finance them. And if we talk about grant financing, and this is basically what we really hope for, that most of financing will come in grants, not in loans, then all local governments, even small ones, can receive grants from any international donors or private business, whatever. I mean, like, grants are possible. When we talk about loans, like external loans from some international organizations or countries, then there are some limitations that local governments cannot do this. But if we talk about projects, about capacity building, about grants for some reconstruction, it's all possible to be financed. And therefore, yesterday I was really thankful to hear that there are already kind of cooperations between different cities on rebuilding and reconstruction of some facilities and some companies on the areas which were deoccupied by our army. And this is what we really hope for, such information, but this information should be monitored, it should be published. And the platform that I've talked about is this digital reconstruction management platform or system. It is advocated by civil society at the moment, and pretty much advocacy is going on with the Ministry of Digital Transformation and Ministry of Infrastructure. But even though there is a clear idea how it is built, that it should contain all information on the priority projects, on the facilities which are to be reconstructed or renovated or repaired, there should be information on who is financing what. So the idea is already there, but it's not under implementation at the moment. There are kind of some debates and discussions on how it should go. And here I would like also to mention that we really need some more openness of the data, which was closed by the government during this heavy war period. And we hope that it will be open, because Ukraine also did really good on the openness of the data before the full-scale invasion. And civil society to be watchdogs and to be implementing, monitoring, etc., really needs this open data to be published by the government or to be published by local governments as well. And therefore, this platform which we are talking about and we advocate for is really needed for the government also, just to have all information in one place. It is needed by civil society to understand where money go and how it is spent. It is needed by the donors just to see who is financing what and where some money should go, and to be sure that money are spent efficiently and effectively. And this is basically all about trust. So all this transparency brings trust that we are spending our money, received money from international donors in an efficient and effective way. And that's what actually we advocate as well for.
Fantastic. I think that is again based on the Ukraine's strengths of implementing ProZorro online procurement, and then DoZorro, which was the civic monitoring of online procurement. So I think it's just building on those experiences. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be wrapping up this discussion today. We've covered a lot of ground. As you can see, once you start talking about civil society, you start talking about everything. You talk about economy, you talk about local development, you talk about political culture. This is where, you know, I think we all agree, and we heard it yesterday, we hear it today, that it must be an equal partner in Ukraine's future. It already is a very engaged contributor to resilience of Ukrainian home front, communities, economy. And I think that it gives quite a lot of legitimacy to many projects. Actually, it shares its good reputation with government, because Ukrainian civil society has very good reputation, high level of trust. It is actually contributing to co-governance, I would even say. And I think this is the future of democratic participation. Citizens want to have a stake. Again, I'm re-emphasizing it. They don't want to be just beneficiaries of services. That is needed, of course, but there's, and here why I think also it's so important for Ukraine to win this war, because this is what we want. We want Ukraine to win this war and to have just peace. Not just any peace, but to have a peace that is just, that delivers sustainable security for European continent, and that means the agency of citizens. And that agency actually then fuels hope. And if Ukrainians remain hopeful, which they are today, because if you look at public opinion polling, 60% of Ukrainians are hopeful of the future of Ukraine, despite all this horror, death, destruction that they face on a daily basis. They believe Ukraine has the future. And I think that is why we need to structure this recovery to sustain that hope for Ukrainians, because that is the biggest capital we have. And that is that will carry on Ukraine to this destination it wants to be. So I'd like to ask you to join me in the round of applause for all our speakers who are sitting here. Alexandra, thank you very much. Heather, thank you very much. Thank you. And And we invite you to stay engaged with all of these different projects, with the foundation, with the Open Society Foundations, Renaissance Foundation, German Marshall Fund, and thank you so much for coming in person. Thank you so much.